So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Surbhi Joshi, Coordinator and Advisor, E3-India project, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on E3-India model structure and scenario creation. Now, this is the second webinar in the series of E3-India webinars that we have planned. We have with us today the key speaker, Unada Chiprecha. Unada is Principal Economic Modeler at Cambridge Econometrics. We are also joined by Ranjit Bharvikar, India Program Director, Regulatory Assistance Project, and Becky Wicks, who is a Communications Manager at Regulatory Assistance Project. Becky is the administrator of GoToMeeting for us. Now, as we go ahead, I would briefly delineate the schedule for the webinar and hand it over to Nada for the technical presentation. We plan to take brief clarifying questions along with the presentation, but for the detailed one, I request that we park it for the question and answer session. Let's keep our microphones on mute. It would help us with the audibility. And we are recording this session for future reference. I'll be sharing the previous session and this one along with the presentation which Anada is going to do today to you by next week. Now, before taking any more time, I'm going to introduce the key presenter, Unada Chiprecha. Unada Chiprecha is Principal Economic Modeler at Cambridge Econometrics. She has over 10 years of experience in development and application of CE's E3-ME model, and as well as custom-made country-specific E3 models for India, Brazil, Kosovo, and US. Her recent E3 modeling contributions cover a variety of topics, including energy and resource efficiency, carbon and energy taxation, regulatory standards, environmental tax reform, renewable targets, circular economy, collaborative economy, border tax adjustment, etc. Now, what I would like to add over here is that Unada is the key person who has been developing this model from the scratch. So she is the person who can tell us about ins and outs of this model, its structure, in great detail. So now I hand it over to Unada. Unada, the stage is all yours.
Thank you. So thank you everybody for your time to join us in this presentation. The way I plan to do this session is I'm going to go through some of the key equations in the E3-India model, and then I will swap around to the software itself to show you how to basically launch the model and run baseline and the example scenarios, and how you would then use the model to look at the result and exporting the result. So there's a lot of things to cover. So this basically this webinar is built on what we have covered in the previous session. So in the last session, we look at kind of like the E3-India structure, an overview of how everything fit together in the E3-India model. So before we can do any scenario analysis, I just want to basically make you aware of the interactions between different behaviors in the model. Now that is done through a series of econometrics equations, the E3-India being a macroeconometric model. So the econometrics equations form the biggest kind of like part of the model, if you like. So I would like just to go through quickly through each of the equations, but we don't have time to go through them all in details. So in summary, the stochastic equation, or what we call the econometric relationships in the model, there are 16 of them. So we're splitting them to these 5 different groups. Energy, we have the aggregate level of energy demand, and then we have 4 different types of disaggregated fuels: coal, oil, gas, and electricity. On the economic side, we have the consumer demand at aggregated level, and then the share of consumer demand. We have investment demand, and on the labor side, we have an equation for employment. We have a wages, is one of the equations in the labor market groups, and participation rate. Then we have a look at the price set of the equations. So we have industry price, export and import price, and then on the trade, we have external export and import. So these form the 16 different equations. Now, here in this presentation, I'm only going to give you a very quick overview because I want to move on to the key interactions in the model and show you kind of like how everything fit together when it comes to scenario analysis. So I provided a link here, which some of you may already been aware of, to the model manual. So volume 4 in particular have the model specification in that. So I'll just quickly show you what it looked like and how you can. So if you are interested in the key equations in the model and the rationale behind each of the econometric equations, you can come to this document in particular. And if you still have any questions, then please feel free to contact me. Yeah, and I'll be happy to respond. So let's go back to the presentation if I can find it. Here, okay. So let's go through quickly the econometric equation on the economic side one by one. So last webinar, we show you this national accounting structure of the E3-India model, where the input-output is in the heart of it, and then we have the component of final demand. And going down, we have the value-added part. Now, the one that are circled are the one that we are covering here in the econometrics behavior side. So let's first go to the aggregated consumer demand. So I'm just going to discuss the bit that highlight to see how these relationships are feeding into each other in our model. So the total consumer demand is a function of real income. So if anything happened to inflation, that it would affect the real disposable income. But also the inflation itself also play a part in our econometric equation for total consumer demand. Real rate of interest, that to reflect the saving incentive, and then the unemployment rate is added in that to create some sort of uncertainty for the consumer spending. Okay, and again, as I mentioned, please go ahead and look at the model manuals to find out the rationale behind including each of these explanatory variables and the theory behind it and why we chosen these variables. Okay, so that was the total consumption. The consumer share, spending share, is estimated again using the real disposable income, but also the related price of products. So in comparison to other prices. We have inflation and real rate of interest also play a part in explaining consumer spending for a particular consumer product. Next is the investment demand. So investment, these are done by sectors and regions. So we have 20 sectors in E3-India and 32 regions. So there are 20 times 32 equations for the investment demand in itself. So there are a lot of equations within the E3-India model. So for the investment by a sector is a function of its real output. but also the relative price of investment compared to the average price of a sector, and then a real rate of interest as well. So the sum of these equations, if you're comparing it to our main E3-ME model, they are basically a shorter form, partly because of the data availability. So we're concerned about the degree of freedom in our equation. So that's why we couldn't keep adding on lists of explanatory variable in our equation here. Okay, so next is the trade side of the final demand. For external export, this is explained by rest of the world demand, which is exogenous to E3-India model, but it's one of the exogenous input that you can play around with. Export price and technology variables, so that's play a role in explaining the level of external export demand by for each state. The import demands is explained by domestic demand, basically the sales in domestic market and the related price between imports product compared to the domestic product. So there's a substitution there, and the technological variables. Again, this is done by sectors and by regions for each of the 32 Indian states. Now, on the labor market side, we have the participation rates split by genders and by regions, so male and female for all the 32 states. And the decision to join the labor force is explained by the general economic activities, average wage, and unemployment. Again, you can refer back to the manual on the theory behind it. An employment demand basically is a derived demand from output, so industry output, and the wage level. So wages refer to cost of labor. And we derive unemployment by subtracting labor force, which come from our participation rate, multiplied by working population, which is exogenous to the model. And then there's a small adjustment because the data are coming from different sources. So I think for the participation rate, we got that from the labor force surveys. By employment, we might have got it from the national account. Okay, so for the wage rate, this is the wage bargaining kind of like theory behind the equation here. So wage rate in a sector, in a region, is a function of wages in other sectors. So what other sector wage rate have an influence on the wage rate being set in particular sector, and also on the productivities, inflation and unemployment. Moving on to the prices now. So prices is explained by the we're estimating marks up from unit cost really. So for each sector and regions, we estimated the parameter attached to the unit cost, which comprise 3 separate costs: material costs, which we can get from the input-output relationship, the labor cost, so the wage equation, and also the employment equation, give us the total labor cost for each of the of each of the industry. And then the tax, which is exogenous, but we can adjust this. So if we want to tax a particular sector in particular, then we can add that in, and that would affect the unit cost. And the key things here is that because it's econometrically estimated, we have a parameter attached to the unit cost, and that parameter represents the pass-through rate from cost to price of an industry. So in our model, we don't assume a one-to-one cost pass-through, if you like. So how much of the cost get passed through when we're introducing tax policy, for example, to an industry, is depend very much on the industry characteristic. Some of them may be operating a very competitive market, and they might have to take a hit on their cost increase through lower profit, and that would then reflect in our estimated parameters. and that's how we go about and start to understand the result that's coming out from the model. So the industry price affected mostly by unit cost, but also input price and technology. Okay, and that was a group. That was the group of the economics equation. On the energy equation, we have two level, if you like, method where we estimate first the aggregate final energy demand by different users. So we have 8 users. These users are industry user, which we translate from the economic sector to energy users, but also we including transport and household as additional users. And these are the demand for energy in total. And we estimating that as a function of economic activity for each user. So for household, this is equivalent to the household spending. For industry, this is the industry output. And the related price of energy, the average energy cost to other factors, and technical progress as also as part of the explanatory variable. So once we have the final energy demand, we then split it out by different type of fuels. So currently we have coal, oil, gas, and electricity, which the key substitution between gas and electricity really, between gas and electricity for household, but the rate of switching is depending on relative price. So if price of electricity is cheaper than gas, then there will be more substitution towards electricity and so on. Okay, so the only thing that is not covered in the econometric equation for energy demand is the power sector, which I think we have discussed in the previous webinar, how it's used a bottom-up modeling FTT model to provide a result, because with the power sector technology, the rate of change is so fast that we don't think that we can capture it from the historical economic energy data, because the technology weren't there 10 years ago for us to form an equation, and therefore we thought that a bottom-up kind of like technology model is more suited in predicting how the power sector energy demand will go forward. Okay, so that was just a really quick introduction to our stochastic equations. Nonetheless, I thought it was important to highlight how variables are linking in each equation set, because it then frames your mind before you're going and looking at scenario impact, for example, because sometimes it might not be obvious that, you know, a cause and the effect, but at the same time you get other effects going on within the model. Okay, so last week I presented this slide, which I don't think Hector has included in his webinar the week before. But this is just to show you, only on the economy side, how we have these impacts between different economic variables. So starting off with the very shortest loop. So imagine this is a scenario where we have exogenous increase in investment. So we would plug in a shock to investment here. This essentially have an effect on the total demand. So what will go towards, when we make an investment, it might go towards investment sector like construction or engineering. So the demand for those sectors will increase, and that will lead to increased output of that particular sector, which in turn lead to an increase in input of those sector. And the shortest loop here is equivalent to the type 1 multiplier, if you like, if you're only looking at input-output type analysis. But in our model, it's go further than that, because part of the input to production is labor. So when there is a shock to demand, we have an increase in employment demand, and that essentially affect total level of income. Okay, there's wages playing a role here as well, but total income will change, and then that will affect the household expenditure, and again, feeding back to the total demand. This is a demand by slightly different, because this is a consumer demand. So when it goes to total demand by sector, we are talking more about consumer sector, like I don't know, restaurants or other consumer spending that we spend the most. And then that would then have a knock-on effect on output and so on. So not only the initial shock to investment create type 1 multiplier, we're now looking at type 2 type multipliers on labor and income. Now, the model, again, go further than that, because some of these demands are met from external, right? So from outside India or from outside the state, through the trade relationship. So some of those will be met by imports. Now, if it's an intra-state import, then that will affect other state export, which in turn affect economic activity within that state. And again, some of those could come from the export of the original state. So that's complete our trade loop within India. However, for imports from outside India, this will go outside the model coverage currently, so it doesn't have any feedback. We can adjust the economic activity of other world region exogenously in our model to have some sort of feedback coming through, but that has to be done manually. So just, yeah, so hopefully this will give you an overview of like a shot into just one shot into investment and how it feeds through to other component of the model. And each of these, we have the econometric equation that explain the relationship and the magnitude of a particular sector and industry, and of sector and region. So it's very complex, and it's a big task to bring all these parameters together, and also linking it and getting the model to solve in the first place was quite difficult for us, but we're here now. We have this feedback in the model. Okay, so just to give you a quick example of, I think I have 3 different examples of a scenario, if you like, and how the effect feeding through to the rest of the model. So when we model a carbon tax in the E3-India model, we'll get the environmental result. So because it's an E3-India model, it cover energy, it cover emission, so we get that as well, not just the economic impact. However, the economic impact also have feedback into the energy demand and so on. And what I wanted to point out is that when we introduce a carbon tax, most people would think, well, that's bad for the economy. We should see the negative impact coming through. Now, that's correct, because a carbon tax causes price of energy to increase, and that affects industry price, because industry have to buy energy as part of their production, and also consumer price through directly from their use of energy, but also through the price increase of the consumer goods that come from higher production costs by industry. Again, this price pass-through rate is depending on the parameter estimated. So in some firm, some of the industry, the increase in cost may not be passed through at all if they want to absorb some of the cost increase themselves because they fear of losing market share and so on. But some of the costs will get passed through, but not always 100%. Okay, so that price increase affect the consumer price, which affect real income, because we model incomes in real term, and presumably wages doesn't increase as fast as the price. So we would see a net negative impact on real income, and that would have an implication on consumption, which then feeds through to industry output. From the industry side, that will also have an effect on competitiveness. So the input substitution, for example, if import price is not subject to the same level of the tax increase, and eventually that would affect the industry output, both coming through from the competitiveness side, but also reduction in consumption, and that would have a knock-on effect on employment demand, because employment is part of the production process, and again complete the real income loop. Now that would provide a negative forces to the GDP. However, we have an if a country or a state is a net importer of energy, then by introducing a carbon tax, one could reduce these energy imports as a result. Now, because import is treated as a negative demand, so a reduction in import should improve GDP of a state. So it is possible to get a positive impact on GDP if we reduce a lot of fuel import, and at the same time we don't see the 100% cost pass through. I have to mention that profit in E3-India doesn't get treated endogenous, so there's no link for a reduction in profit to reduction in investment currently. Okay, the other way that we can see some positive result, actually, this is linked out the power sector model. So what we see is that if we have a carbon tax applied to the power sector, that's actually encouraging investment in new technology, so new renewable technology, because the use of coal and oil and gas are now more expensive. So there is an investment feedback coming back through the economic result, and that's another positive impact that could be coming through from a simple carbon tax scenario. So yeah, so I just want to show really that these are very complex scenario, even with just one simple input to the model. Okay, so in the next case, just building on from the carbon tax scenarios, so let's assume that the net effect is very negative. The carbon tax increased price and causes industry to lost its competitiveness because there is a higher cost to them. Okay, so what we could do is that we can set our scenario to use the revenue gathered from the carbon tax to be used to reduce other taxes. So in our example that come with the model, I think there are three ways that we use the revenues to recycling back to the economy. In this case, we assume to be using the carbon tax revenue to reduce employer social security contribution. Now, essentially, what this will do is lower labor cost to industry. Okay, so their unit cost on energy has increased, but we are using some of the revenue to lower unit labor costs, so helping industry in a way to lower other costs, and hopefully will create some sort of double dividend coming out from this scenario by using the revenue this way. What we often find is that if you use the revenue to reduce employer social security contribution, is that you often make labor more attractive, and we usually find the employment result are most positive if you use the revenue in this way. But the reason the linkages, if you like, is very similar to the case of tax, but in the opposite direction. So we lower the cost, we should see the reduction in industry price. Again, this rate of pass-through is the same rate as the cost pass-through. So when there are cost decrease or cost saving, not all the saving will be passed through to the industry price, because industry might want to keep it themselves as a higher profit and so on. But yeah, so that's the framework for the feedbacks when we're adding the revenue recycling on top of the original carbon tax scenarios. Okay, so lastly, no, actually, I think I have one more after this. The impact of energy efficiency. So moving on to a different scenario now, where instead we're looking at energy efficiency type scenarios. So energy efficiency, we model it by introducing an exogenous reduction in energy consumption for a particular sector, or however you define your scenarios. So it could be, for example, manufacturing sector reduction in coal consumption. We would plug that in. Now, these information have to be gathered outside the model as part of your kind of like input. So it can either come from a bottom-up engineering model that estimate different type of technology, how much it costs and how much potential saving there are, or it can come from a publication like the IEA, for example. They have roughly estimated the energy saving per dollars, for example, that we can plug in. So that gets plugged in exogenously, the reduction in energy consumption. What need to go with it is the investment level required for these energy efficiencies technology to happen, and also the assumption on how these investments are to be paid for. For example, if we assume that the public sector make an investment, do they have to increase other taxes in order to achieve revenue neutrality? And if so, we need to build that in as well in our scenario specification. Okay, so let's just say that we have the investment number and we have the reduction in the energy consumption numbers. We plug that in as an input. So the energy efficiency is essentially saving you, so you buy less energy per unit of production, and that will have a knock-on effect through industry price and real income. Similarly to the case where we added cost to the industry, this is reducing costs. However, what the model can capture is the rebound effect that perhaps some of the economic model or other model cannot capture, because it's not as complete. But what we have is the E3 link between energy, environment, and economy. What this means is that when we added extra investment, or when we save from not spending so much on energy anymore, there are more money to spend elsewhere. So say a consumer now not having to spend $10 a month on fuel, they can use that $10 to spend it on other goods and services, which would automatically capture in our modeling framework here. And essentially that creates a knock-on effect on the other goods and services demand, which in turn create demand for energy. So the initial saving from the energy efficiency that we put in as an exogenous input may not be as large when we take into account of these rebound effects. And it can be quite important, really. Like I think the IEA say that it can be up to 50% of the initial saving. So yeah, and also on the investment side, this will create demand for investment good. Like say, for example, if we create demand for engineering, that might lead to a higher demand for iron and steel being used, and that iron and steel production will require a higher energy input, and so on. Okay. So the last one before I move on to the model itself is the feed-in tariff. So this is again is another type of the example scenario that we have included in the standard model testing. So it's getting a little complicated, but I just want to show this complex relationship so that you can try to figure out the key step of checking the model result and understanding it when we're looking at this feed-in tariff scenarios. So feed-in tariff can be plugged in as an exogenous input for each of the 24 power sector technology for each of the states. So if you want to add feed-in tariff for solar in one state and then add in feed-in tariff for wind in another state, then you can. Essentially what it does is will reduce the levelized costs for the investor. However, the feed-in tariff has to be paid for by higher electricity price. So within the power mix, it will make the technology that have the feed-in tariff more attractive, and as a result, it will create additional investment for that particular technology. But overall, we'll have a different set of electricity price that we can work out from the average levelized cost, but also the bit that we have to pay for the feed-in tariff itself. And that would feed into the electricity demand equation. So this is final demand for electricity. So what consumers, household or industry demand for industry will depend on the electricity price. If you go back to our disaggregated energy demand equation. And that again will feed back to the power sector, which again could have an effect on power mix and so on. So, and in terms of the economic side, electricity price will feed into the consumer price and industry price, and that will have a knock-on effect in other part of the economy, which essentially will feed back into the economic activity of different fuel users, which would then affect going back to electricity demand again. And what coming out from the power mix would also determine fossil fuel imports. So if you add in feed-in tariff for renewable technology, it could be that we have a reduction in coal or oil imports, which could then lead to positive impact on the economy. Again, this is just to give you an overview of how everything interacts together, and just to show you that the model is fairly complete. Yeah, so that is a two-way effect going on everywhere. So the model for each year of the solution is solved until everything is kind of like we get a solution, basically a converged solution each year before moving on to next year. So yeah, so there are a lot of things going on before it reach a kind of like a stable solution for that particular year before moving on to the next year. Okay, so now we will have a look at the model itself. In this presentation, I have added many step-by-step screen grab, but I won't go through these here. I will instead switch to the software itself and show you how to do this in the software. But this slide will be available, so you can always refer back when you come to play around with the model yourself. Okay, so so yeah, let's go to that. So if you haven't already downloaded the model, you can download it from the website. You just have to type in your registration detail, and then you'll be given a link to download the model. So I recommend you doing that again, even if you downloaded it a while ago, because we have recently this week uploaded a new version. Okay, so when you download the model, within the folder there are a folder called E3-India, and there's two Word document which contain user guide and example scenarios. So what you would do is you would make a copy of the E3-India folder and put it in somewhere local to your local disk, because it will need to write the result file to that particular folder. So when you click on the folder, you'll see the content here, and the software, to launch it, you just need to click on the shortcut called Manager here, and that should bring you to your internet browser. Now, we highly recommend using the Google Chrome to launch the model. And within that, you should see a different tab coming up. Now, sometimes the internet history caches stop this introduction page from displaying introduction information. But essentially, if you're opening it for the first time, you should get details explaining basically the E3-India software. But it's not a lot. It just says this is an E3-India software. But yeah, to fix this, I just need to clear my internet history in order to make it appear again. But anyway, so this is the software, what it looks like. So it's very simple by design, so not to overwhelm any other users. So there are different tabs here that you can click on. The data bank tab is empty. It's left intentional because eventually, I think what we want to do is for the user to be able to click on the model data bank in order to display result automatically. But at the moment, you can look at the model result, model data using the model result tab. So just ignore that for now. The next three tabs are basically the input to the model. There are three keys: input, what we call instruction file is one set of input, scenario file is another set of input, and the assumption file is another input type. So to run the model, we need to set the three type of inputs to run one run. Now, in each case, we have a default file, which is highlighted in dark blue, and then the test scenario that coming with it. And similarly, for the scenario file, we have different types. And these, you should refer back to the document that come with the model, called testing scenarios, which have a summary here of the three input that is needed in each run. So, for example, in the baseline, we have a default baseline, which is been calibrated to the official publication by the IEA. But yeah, so each of these three input are varied in the test scenarios, and if you refer back to the description, you'll know what the test scenario are. So, for example, if we run the model with the forecast file, idiom forecast file called ntest1, that means we're running a scenario that has the exogenous investment added to it. Yeah. Okay. So to go back to our model. So basically, essentially what these are, they are text files, and which can be displayed here. Now, there are different level of of complexity between them. But essentially they are all text file. And once you start to understand the model better, you realize how easy it is to set up scenarios. And these correspond to the input in our folder. So again, if you have a text editor, you can open this up separately. So this is where the scenario file is stored. This is where the assumption file is stored. And this is where the idiom forecast file is stored. So once you feel a bit more comfortable, you can play around with this directly. But you can also display it in here to high script and high script. And so what do they contain then? So the idiom instruction file essentially just contains lots of commands that's setting up the model run. So it reads in data from the data bank as a starting point. So historical data, it reads in like model input for different variable from the data bank. Now what we could do here, the option that we could do here is to adjusting those values or the actual value that we read from the data bank and plug that in, or we can add in exogenous investment. The problem with our model essentially is because it's so large and each variable contains three-dimensional data, so by region, by sector, and by industry, and by time. It's just not feasible to list all of the model variable input in a nice kind of like tables, because there will be so many of them that we will lose our focus in terms of the file. So this place of idiom instruction is a good way of adjusting the three-dimensional input, and that only require one line of code or two lines of code. If you want to adjust something with the three-dimensional dimension. Okay, so the scenario file contains exogenous policies. So if we show script, you'll see from the list what these are. So we have energy tax and the dimension of coverage. So we can have the energy tax that is attached to different users. So you might want to tax some user more and not tax other at all. So we have a switch that goes with that. And we have carbon tax again attached to different user of different type of fuels as well. So for example, if you want to tax household use of electricity without taxing other industry, and you can do that. Or if you want to tax household a different rate than you tax industry, again, you can do that. And you can change the tax rate over time by different state. Okay. And in here, you also find the automated revenue recycling option, whereby it takes revenues from the carbon tax or energy tax. And then if you type 1, then it will reduce, will use the whole revenues to reduce that particular tax accordingly. Otherwise, if you type 0.5, it will only use a half for recycling and so on.
Yep.
Okay, the assumption file set of input is more about the exogenous variables. So what we believe to be kind of like international Brent oil price, for example, is our growth rate year on year. But also, as I mentioned, that other countries outside India are treated as exogenous, so their GDP growth rate are included here. And you can change the assumption accordingly in order to find the effect that's coming through in the E3-India model. And for each of the state, so that's the global that would apply to all states. But for each state, we also have the interest rate assumption, which is exogenous, but also government spending and share of government spending that you can play around with, and also the tax rate and benefit payment and so on. So these are the exogenous policies on the fiscal and monetary spending that you can play around with. Okay. Again, there's a lot of information to take on, but you can just starting off with the default test scenario that we have, and then going back to the user manuals to then, if you're a bit more brave, play around with a different type of input. Using an existing example as a template, and then set it to run. And if you have any problem, or if you want to set up a more complex scenario, then I'll be more than happy to get involved. Okay, Next is the list of variables. The tab, this is just a static tab, doesn't have anything that you can change, but it just lists all the model variable that we will present in the model result. But the key thing, the key tab for running the model is here, the tab called running the model, which is self-explanatory. So when you open up this tab, you get the default three input file. So the end forecast coming from idiom instruction file, assumption coming from assumption file, and base send is the baseline scenario file, default file. And if you look through the list, you'll see that there are the preloaded test scenario which correspond to that table in the user guide. Okay, but this is the default three input that we would need. And to run the model, we just need to type in the output file. It can be any name that is that makes sense for yourself. So for example, this is our baseline run. So I'm just going to type the name baseline. But if it's a scenario run, then you can then just type in the name of the scenario or any numbering coding that you understand what this output file is referring to. Okay, and once you type in the name, you just set it to run. So it should, yeah, it will. So these are the models. So the models solve year on year. So at the moment, it goes back to historical period just to set the starting dynamic. So the model is based on the last year lag. So that's why it's solving the historical period first. And then it's just going to move on to create the solution for the endogenous period from 2013 onward, I think, or 2013 onwards to 2035 currently. So this is not a result by any means, it's just a summary of the model being solved live. But you can already see that that it has some sort of a summary growth rate in each year. We have carbon, CO2. I don't think this is a growth rate instead. It's in a gigaton of CO2. GDP change, consumption change, investment change, export changes, import price, industry price, consumer price, export price, import price, wages, trade balance, public balance, and unemployment rate. And this basically just gives you a summary while you sit back and watch the model being solved. However, it becomes quite obvious, especially in the forecast period. So during the historical period, it comes through in the data that we got this high year-on-year growth rate, because the historical data is not always necessarily smooth. But in the solution period, we should see our projection, at least in the baseline, a very smooth solution. So if we can see an obvious jump, say for example, going from kind of like 5% a year to like 10%, then I think clearly, unless it's your input that you shock a massive investment into a particular year, then it's a sign that something is going wrong. But yeah, so it will take about 2 or 3 minutes to run through. I actually might stop this from wasting our time, because I've already run this earlier. Once it's finished running, so it will finish all the way up to 2035, and it will then say that it's finished, it's all done. Then you go to the model result tab. What you might need to do is click on refresh in order to bring on the list of the output file. So the output file is a text file that gets saved to, if you go back to the folder, it gets saved through here, and it's just going to be saved under the name that you've given it in the running of the model bit here. Now, what I will do is I will set the first test scenario running, which is in the end test 1, which is the exogenous investment while we're looking at the baseline result. Okay, so it can be any name, as I said. Okay, so currently we only have baseline result, which I ran previously before I came to the core. If you click on that and click on enable front end, it will take a little while to load, not too long, hopefully. Then you'll see what coming up here, which is a lot of options for you to select. So, so currently we only have one run, so we can only display the result of this run, which on its own might not be as interesting, because if you're running different scenario, you want to be able to compare it against some sort of baseline. But yeah, so if you want to run, if you only want to look in at the numbers for each of the run, then this is what you'll do. You're opening it up, you're loading it, and in here there's a lot of variables that you can look at. So if, for example, we just want to look at consumer spending by category, we will click on.
The person you are speaking with has put your call on hold. जिस व्यक्ति से आप बात कर रहे हैं, उसने अभी आपकी कॉल को होल्ड पर रखा है.
Okay, is everyone can still hear me? Yes.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that has now loaded. So yeah, so when you click on variable, depending on variable, whether it's 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional, you'll see the list coming here, appearing. So for consumer spending, we have it breakdown by different type of consumer classification, but also by state. So we can click on one particular state and all sector, and you should see the result coming, showing as a line chart here. We can select different states, and it should be quite quick. I think it's a bit sluggish here because I'm running the model in the background, but also I'm using this interface to share my screen, so normally it's much quicker. But you can select different states. You also can select more than one or two states, and then the software will automatically sum those numbers for you, and you can sum across different dimensions. So for example, if you want to only display the first 5, but then sum that, that means that we're summing the result for the 9 state and across the 5 different categories. So it's quite handy, really. And there's an option to show a table of data, and then you can download this as CSV, so you can click on that and it should automatically save it to CSV file for you if you want to use data for further graphic, for example. Now the data will be automatically summed across the dimension, so if we didn't sum this, then we will see that the table get changed automatically to whatever you selected. Okay, so that's only on consumption, but we have result for energy, for example, fuel use, slightly sluggish. I don't expect it to be when you come to do it yourself. Okay, so again, you'll see that now the list of the classification changed because we're now talking about energy demand. So we have 8 different energy demands. So we can look at demand for household, sum across dimension, or don't sum this, and see how it differ between states. Okay, now let me check if this is finished. So it's still running, so it's still a while to go. But as you can imagine, when we have more than one set of results, so if we have a baseline, the scenario that I'm about to finish now, we can reload the data and compare the result between the two runs, which is very useful because you then can work out the either an absolute change from the baseline or relative change from the baseline. So you'll be able to say for an exogenous shock of 10 billion rupee to investment in the manufacturing sector, the net change in GDP is this 10 billion compared to the baseline, or a percentage increase from the baseline. And that can be done at very detailed dimensions. So again, if you select for a particular state, for a particular sector, the result would automatically calculate for you the different, the absolute different, or the relative different, or just simply the two level along side by side. Okay, so I think it will take a while for the model to finish because it's only at 2020. So I am going to pause there, and we can come back to it later if we have time, but otherwise I'm happy to finish that and take questions.
Okay. Thank you, Nada. Yeah, Professor Ghosh. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Now, if I have understood the model correctly, consumption is based on incomes, and incomes are being estimated by wages, employment, and there is also a non-wage income. I've been going through the manual. There is also a non-wage income. So is it that these, econometric estimates of disposable income in the form of wage and non-wage, do they add up to the value addition from the input-output table? Are they consistent with the value addition from the input-output table?
Yes, they are. So you're right. So it's based on the disposable income, and total income include non-wages income, like what we call the residual income, but also the benefit payment from the government, and a net of the disposable income tax. So so they are consistent. So for example, if you change the tax rate, that will affect the disposable income,
Yes.
and that will have that would have a knock-on effect on the consumption and so on.
No, what I'm asking is, we have econometric estimates of the wage income, right? We have econometric estimates of wage income from the labor market, and the wage rate estimates. We can find out the total wage income in various sectors of the economy. Now, there is also total value addition from the input-output table. All right. So, is it that the residual income is equal to the total value added minus wage income? Is that how we ensure this kind of consistency?
That's correct. Yeah. So everything is based on the national accounting framework. So we make sure that everything's add up. So yeah. So the non-wage income form the value added part, like you said, and that should be that should be consistent in the framework. Now there might be some inconsistency through our data. So the data itself does not always add up. But in terms of the impact that coming from the model, we made sure that the impacts are consistent.
I have one more question, if you allow me. Hello.
Yes,
I have one more.
Sure.
Yeah. In the econometric estimation part, okay, if I understand correctly, when we get the econometric estimates from the model and we plot them against the projections obtained from International Energy Association, there is a gap between the endogenous solution from the model and the projections of IEA. Now, is this gap? Is it due to the different nature of the data in the two data sets, or is it due to shortfalls in econometric estimation?
Yes.
What I'm saying is, we have a data set. On the basis of that data set, we are estimating certain variables. Now, those estimates are, I suppose, they are econometrically robust. Now, but when we put those estimates against official projections, there is a gap. There is previous presentations, we have seen that there is a gap. Is that gap due to the fact that the nature of the data that has been used to model and the nature of the data that is obtained from IEA is different. Is that the reason for the gap?
Okay, so the IEA only provide the forecast period, if you like. So what we do is we obtain the econometric estimation from historical data, and we use that to drive our projection forward. Now, without any calibration in our forecast, it will then become a forecasting exercise, right? Where we use the past historical data to drive our result for the projection period. Now that is useful when we do a forecasting exercise, but it's less useful when we come to do scenario analysis, because we need to be able to match our baseline to a published or officially acceptable projections. Now, these projections, like the IEA, it contains a lot of information that we not necessarily would be able to include from the parameter we estimated. For example, the announced policies, like say, for example, if China announced that they would include energy reduction planned in 2015 going forward. Now, the IEA came up with an estimate of how that is incorporated in their baseline. Now, what we do is we took the IEA baseline, the one that we think is acceptable, which we use the current policy. I think that's what they use to compare that. So we process that information from the IEA. We're trying to change the classification to match to our model, and then we have that, and we call it exogenous forecast. And what we do is we run the model endogenously and work out the gap from our solution to the actual projection in the IEA, and that is what we call the model residuals. Now, this by no means is to create any bias at all in our result, because these residuals of the adjustment to get into the IEA forecast is stored, and it gets used in every single run. So you're just shifting basically our projection up and down, and then any kind of like result after that in the different run is get compared to the same baseline with the same adjustment.
I got your point. Now, just one more question. In the results, in the results page, we found that trade balance and public balance, they are left blank. Now, for application in a country like India, we should be very much concerned about the impacts of various energy policies on trade balance and public balance, because macroeconomic scenario building would require impacts on trade balance, public balance. So do you think this can be rectified?
That is something we'll identify for our next question. So for the public balance, I think we have government spending and we have revenue from different taxes, but we do not cover all the tax base. So that's why we intentionally didn't want to include it in our result. We are, I think, in discussion with RAB to expand this bit of the model. But that would mean that we have to make sure that all the revenue stream are correct. Because currently you can work out the change government budget by adding the tax revenue that we generated or the change in spending from the model variable currently. But we did not estimate further the government balance in terms of trade balance, similarly, we did not have that because our trade data is quite poor. And because we're looking at the 32 state solutions, I think that's why the trade balance there might represent the interstate. So that's why the net is 0. But if you're looking at the individual state, we have a result for import and export for each state. So that can be worked out.
Yeah, even if it is not done with for individual states, can we have it for the economy as a whole? I mean, effects on trade balance and public balance, if at least the economy-wide effects, macro effects are incorporated, I think that would be, I mean, this is just a suggestion that probably that would add some value, more value.
Yeah.
If yeah, and one more thing is money supply in the model is assumed to be endogenous.
Yes, that's right.
Is there any rationale? Is it because we go for interest rate targeting in India? Countries like India, we often go for not money supply targeting, we go for interest rate targeting. Is that the reason why money supply is endogenous, or what is the rationale behind?
Yeah, so it's the nature of our model. So I'm not going to claim that I'm totally on top of this issue, but Hector has written some response previously. It was asked before about this money supply, but essentially, basically with the investment equations, we assume endogenous money where we have access to credit, if you like, and bank can create money to have endogenous growth. So if you're really interested in that, I will forward you his response, because I don't want to give a false answer.
Acha, I'm sorry, one more question. Nowadays, there are a lot of capital flows also. A lot of capital flows that affect investment in India.
Yeah.
Do you think that could also be incorporated, capital flows in affecting, international capital flows affecting investment?
The FDI part. Yeah, so it's again, there's a lot of potentials. For us, really, what we need is the data, and essentially the data has to be split by state and by industry for us to be able to do anything meaningful econometrically. Yeah, so yeah, again, like a lot of things that we're not able to do in this model is due to data limitation. Even with this version, we only have input-output table for not all the states, for only a few. So yeah, so it's work in progress, and we hope that by having the structure here, we can always improve it with data.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Surabhi?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure, Professor Mukhopadhyay.
Yeah, so I missed first 30 minutes, but I was just looking at your carbon tax presentations when you were saying carbon tax, and normally most of the countries offered like a low carbon infrastructure technology, like the revenue used as a low carbon infrastructure technology. So is it possible to that is also to capture into the model, or to feed into the model, this kind of, to use the carbon tax revenue? Is it possible?
Yes, so what we could do, so part of the power sector model is the subsidy of the renewable technology that we can plug in. Now, if we're looking at the subsidy for renewable technology on its own, then we have to find funding. Someone has to pay for it, and usually we assume that government have to raise tax elsewhere to pay for this subsidy. Now, if we run a scenario alongside carbon tax, we can use that revenue instead to pay for the renewable subsidy, and that will be a way of creating a revenue neutral and at the same time promoting renewable energy.
Okay, and you were also showing the energy tax and energy tax for different categories. So is it possible to apply the energy tax for different household categories? Is it possible?
Yeah, so not different household categories. So household is, we only have one group of household in our model.
Is there any option in future that we can separate the household categories?
Yeah, so we have been asked this already, and we have done something, but it's not very complicated. So what we did is for the electricity tax, we actually have an option to have the tag filter through to different different income groups, because I believe this is an issue in India, where you have the electricity subsidies applied, and but at the moment, basically what it does is when you apply only electricity at the moment, because we managed to get the electricity consumption by different household groups. So we know how much each group use electricity. And what we did is when we have added policy input, which is electricity subsidy by different type of household in there. So when you remove this subsidy, essentially you're making all the household paying the same rate of electricity price. And what we can look at the model is what it had in terms of distribution impact. But it's only one way, so it goes through the distribution impact rather than having any more feedback from the electricity and demand by different type of household, because at the moment household are grouped as one.
Okay, so the different household category, as you were talking, did you find the data from SAM or did you collect data from the CSO?
I think it was from CSO. So we have on the income side, the spending, how much they spend on the fuels, and on the income side, we have their income made up from different type of income. So, and on the spending, we have on their fuels, and then we can apply the average subsidy, I think, because we got the price paid. So I think what it was is the price for electricity you pay is depend on the level of consumption. Is that right in India? So if you use more electricity, there's a different price band, and we can link that average consumption of electricity of each household to that price band to proxy for the subsidies. And and that you have an option to play around with this subsidy. I have to go back and let you know what data source I was used, because it was done a while ago and I couldn't remember.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've already overshot the time by 15 minutes. If there is any other quick question, I'll just take it and then we'll wind up. Okay. First of all, Nada, thanks a lot for this presentation. Actually, we wanted this to be a more hands-on session, but thought that sharing the rationale would be much more important. So what we are planning is we would be having this Friday session as well on 29th. And if you are interested, if some of you are interested, we can turn it into a more hands-on session for you. So just let me know if it's feasible for you to join us on Friday, September 29th from 4 to 5 p.m. And this brings us to the end of this webinar. I sincerely thank all of you for giving us time and for your suggestions and your inputs. And we'll meet next week, hopefully. And I would be sharing the recording and the presentation by Unada. Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Unada, Ranjit.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.